This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 5, entitled Forces Pushing Towards the Creation of a Global State. Section H, continuing straight on, Economic and Political Unions. Unquestionably, the planet's most famous economic and political union is the EU, the European Union. It started as the implementation of a vision by a handful of pioneers who reasoned that the most effective way to prevent yet another major war between France and Germany, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, World War I and World War II, would be to so integrate their economies that war between the two countries would become totally impractical, unthinkable. The first step was the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, which integrated the coal and steel industries of the two countries. You can't wage a modern war without steel. Within a few years, the 6-country European Economic Community, EEC, was formed, which grew in numbers over the years. As the economies of these countries integrated, with tariff barriers removed across their national borders, free movement of capital, of labour, etc., the EEC was transformed into the EU, that is, the European Union, with its connotations of being more politically integrated than just an economic union. A common currency, the euro, was introduced, a European Central Bank, ECB, a democratically elected European Parliament, a European flag, a European Union anthem, which is Beethoven's 9th Symphony's Alle Menschen werden Brüder, all people will become brothers. And now there is growing pressure for a European president, a European constitution or treaty, a European foreign minister, a European defence force, etc. Ad-libbing now, I think most of those things have come to pass. I think there's a European president and so forth. I've not kept up to date on this, I've been doing other things. A growing number of political scientists and writers like myself see the EU as probably the most important stepping stone towards the creation of Globa. You can look upon the EU as a mini-Globa. The Europeans are pioneering the next major step beyond the nation-state. They are outmoding nationalism, creating a new kind of pride that one could call unionism, as distinct from the word union, as in labour union. Ad-libbing, things are more complicated than that because we've recently had Brexit, the exit of Britain from the EU, and perhaps a few other countries may follow suit. So northern European countries, particularly Germany, and other more disciplined, more economically successful northern European countries will solidify and ditch the more lax, lazier southern European countries. Back to the book. Europeans can see the television channels of their neighbouring countries in their living room. This makes the peoples of the other European Union countries seem less alien, less far away. The European Parliament and the European Commission, the executive body of the EU, foster the growth of a European ideology, using such devices as a Euro flag, blue background with 12 yellow stars in a circle, a Euro anthem, a Euro currency, the Euro, Euro passports, etc. Young Europeans tend to speak English well and fly from Euro city to Euro city as easily and as cheaply now as Americans do between American cities. To them, Europe is a unit. They think of it as their home. In fact, one of the motivating factors behind the creation of the EU was to create a counterforce to the US. Many Europeans feel themselves superior to Americans in many respects, for example, more humane, cultured and sophisticated than Americans, whom the Europeans describe as being more callous, philistinic and simple-minded. Many Europeans felt resentful that such a parvenu nation as the US has become the world's dominant culture. They feel that the US did not deserve to be number one. given its many inferiorities. Many Europeans see the growth of the EU, already 500 million people, as against the US's 300 million, and the world's largest trading bloc, as a means to push the US quietly off the world centre stage. Political leaders of the EU feel that the EU is now big enough economically to be able to answer back to American economic power with an equal power of its own. The world is becoming multipolar, economically speaking. The US is still way ahead of the EU in military spending, that is about double. So the US is the only military superpower in the world. In fact, the EU is trying to move away from solving conflicts by using force, scorning America's unilateral invasion of Iraq on flimsy grounds, led by a president who is so inarticulate that he is laughed at in Europe. I remember being in Paris shortly after Bush invaded Iraq, seeing an ad for a French magazine with the headline, Bush, l'homme qui nous a gâché l'année. Bush, the man who ruined our year. This logic of creating an economic and political counterforce to the dominance of the US is used by other regions around the world. For example, the South Americans have created Mercosur, an economic and political union of sorts between a handful of South American countries. They too want to have more political and trade leverage against the dominance of the US. The Asians, not to be left out, created ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which recently announced plans to create an EU-like economic and political union. Africa has a well-developed AU, African Union, that is regularly in the world news. In fact, as mentioned in section E above, there are some 50 trade blocs in the world at the time of writing that include nearly all the world's countries, so the time will soon be right for blocs to start merging into bigger blocs, that's BLOC. Even the US, with the largest economy in the world, sees that having larger markets has advantages and has fostered free trade across the planet. The US pushed for the creation of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Area, which is equivalent to EFTA, European Free Trade Area. That is, the first free trade area consisting of many European countries before most of them joined the EU. So at the present time, Canada, the US and Mexico, that is North America, have joined forces to form NAFTA. The US is now pushing for the creation of an FTAA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, that is all 30 plus countries of North, Central and South America, forming a large common market. The total population of the FTAA region would be about 0.8 billion people, so it would make it comparable in population size with China or India. With the US leading the FTAA, it could join the 21st century's billion club. If, however, an Asian Union is created, combining India, China, Korea and Japan, then it would dwarf everyone. It would comprise half the world's population. Since China is not yet a democratic nation, it's unlikely that an ASU, Asian Union, that's ASU, as distinct from AU, which is African Union, or ATU, which is the Atlantic Union, would merge politically to a great extent. Perhaps Japan, India and South Korea, all democratic nations, could form a two-tier system where all four nations form a common market, but only the democratic nations embark on the political unification process, similar to what the Europeans are already doing. The above has discussed the formation of economic and political blocs in the recent past and the near future. What might happen a bit further down the road? At present, there are still a dozen or so nations that want to join the EU, which includes former Soviet Union satellite countries like the Ukraine and Belarus, but they will need to become a lot more democratic before they will be considered as serious EU candidates. The EU already has low tariff agreements with the Mediterranean countries of the Middle East and the North African Arab countries. If a country wants to join the EU, it has to be fairly civilized, in quotes. That is, there are criteria for membership that have to be met before the candidature of a country is considered seriously. For example, candidate countries have to be democracies, respect human rights, have a rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a free press, etc. Turkey has tried several times to join, but has been constantly rebuffed. Even now, Turkish writers can be prosecuted for criticizing Turkish institutions. Such inferiorities are not tolerated by the EU. Thus, to become a member of the EU, countries often have to undergo considerable modernization of their laws and institutions. This has a stabilizing effect on the new members. Thus, the EU plays the role of modernizer and democratizer for many countries in that part of the world. There's growing talk that Russia might join the EU if its former satellites, the Ukraine, Belarus, etc., join. That would add another 140 plus million people to the EU. The EU may later absorb the Mediterranean countries, taking its total population closer to the billion level. What are the prospects for an Atlantic Union? After all, the EU and NAFTA have a lot in common culturally. Canada and the US are former colonies of England and Mexico of Spain. If the US starts feeling small as the size of economic and political blocs keeps growing, then the US may argue, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and decide to form an Atlantic Union, ATU, with the EU. If the current EU, plus Russia, plus the Mediterranean countries and NAFTA, or even FTAA join forces, then we are well over the billion mark. So this new union would be larger than the biggest countries, that is India and China. If Russia is part of this new union, let us call it the WU, Western Union, and if China becomes a democracy in the next 10 or 15 years or so, as I predict, then the writing would be on the wall for a merger of the WU and the ASU, Asian Union. Perhaps the ASU might be called the EAU, Eastern Union. Once this happens, the wind will truly be in the sails of the globists pushing for a global state. How long will all the above take? Probably several decades. Technology is accelerating exponentially, so it's likely that the merging times in the future will be shorter than those of the past. This assumption is based on the idea that it's largely the advances of technology that are causing the world to shrink, to merge into ever larger economic and political blocs. There's an obvious limit to this process, that is, when the unit is the size of the planet. Unless we start colonizing the moon, the asteroids, the planets, etc., as we are bound to do later in the century. In fact, it is vital that we do colonize other worlds so that the human species has more chances of survival in case of some total catastrophe wipes out the human population on the Earth, for example, a large asteroid hitting the Earth, a massive nuclear war, etc. United Nations. The UN, United Nations, and the EU are the two favourite stepping stones towards the creation of a global state. Simply stated, if the EU keeps growing, it could absorb all countries or other blocks of countries into itself until it reaches the size of the planet. The other major route that is often discussed by globist theorists is the transformation of the UN. The UN was a creation that grew out of World War II as a forum for the planet to discuss global issues, particularly to impose sanctions upon and even go to war against errant states. The nationalist realities of the era in which it was founded meant that it was largely a talking shop with little teeth, but gradually it has acquired the role of the planet's conscience. If a group of nations wants to punish some errant nation, then the expectation now is that that group must first get the approval of the UN. The UN did not do this with its invasion the US did not do this with its invasion of Iraq, and subsequently earned the scorn of the rest of the world. The US, as the planet's sole superpower at the time of writing, was materially able to snub the rest of the world and do unilaterally what it wanted. This will become harder and harder to do as the planet unifies culturally. Global public opinion against such actions will become irresistible. As the internet and international television, etc., make people in many countries more sensitive to the views of other countries, then the approval of the UN can only grow in importance. The US lost a lot of prestige over its unilateral decision to invade Iraq without UN approval. One of the tasks of the globists, I think, should be to try to transform the UN step by step into a global government. As the economic and political blocs increase in size, then incrementally the institutions of the UN should be given greater powers and be supported by the political blocs. When China becomes a democracy, this process should be increased dramatically. It would then be possible for Europe, the US, India and China to agree to a large extent on the creation of a UN with more teeth. It's well known that democratic nations do not go to war with each other. Their respective populations will not allow it. Once the major countries or blocs in the world have the same democratic political base and values, they'll be more willing to give up some of their sovereignty to the UN for the sake of creating a more global state. The big countries could then start diffusing smaller wars, and particularly the arms trade. At the present time, the large rich countries or blocs, for example the US, Europe, are major arms traders because there's not yet enough global agreement to stop this diabolical and deadly commerce. Without a binding agreement between the major countries, the argument will remain that, quote, if we don't do it, others will, and they will get the profits of billions of dollars. If the biggest countries and blocs agree to ban arms sales and agree that the UN will punish smaller countries who continue arms sales, then the arms market can be wiped out. There are historical analogies for this, namely the elimination of the slave trade. England made slave trading illegal decades before the US. Since the UK was the dominant sea power in the 19th century, it used its naval muscle to stop slave ships on the high seas. A similar situation could apply with a concerted effort by the largest nations if they come together to ban the arms trade. A transformed UN would have far greater powers than is the case today, but that won't happen until nation-states are willing to give up their sovereignty, which will not happen until those forces pushing towards the creation of a global state are considerable. Discussing what a powerful UN, that is a mere global state, could do in a culturally homogeneous world with a global language and a global mentality is the topic of Chapter 9. J. World Court and International Law. The planet already has a world court. Its role is largely to condemn people who commit crimes against humanity. In practice, these criminals belong to small countries that do not have the power to resist the political pressure of larger countries or blocs. For example, the EU can say to small European countries that want to join the EU that you must hand over your war criminals or you will not be allowed to join. The US refuses to be a signatory to the World Court because it does not want its citizens being sent to The Hague, the city in Holland where the World Court is based. The US remains very much a nationalist, even a chauvinist state. Since it is the dominant nation at the present time and the world's only superpower, it knows it has the strength to snub its nose at the growing global institutions. The US is able to do this, but it loses the world's respect as a result. As the planet culturally homogenizes more, new powers will be given to the World Court. International law will expand, and national laws will become subservient to it. There have been attempts to create an international law of the sea, for example, and of space. As nations form into economic and political blocs, these blocs will create their own courts and their own laws at the bloc or union level rather than at the national level. Gradually, lawmaking will move up from union level to global level. The World Court will not be truly effective until a global state is formed, which will have its own parliament, its own constitution and police force to back up the laws made by a global state. We still have decades to go along this path, but the nucleus is already in place. The planet has a world court, but we do not yet have a world parliament, for example. Most of the institutions needed for a global state are yet to be created. K. Satellite television. There are many stationary orbit telecommunications satellites in place now, giving countries the ability to pick up television and radio channels from other countries if they lie within the footprint of the satellite's downward broadcast signal. A stationary orbit satellite rotates around the Earth at the same angular speed as the Earth rotates. Thus, to an earthbound observer, the satellite appears to be stationary overhead. Of course, a satellite cannot broadcast to a country on the opposite side of the Earth from it. Hence, for a television signal sent up from one country to be received by all countries on the Earth, there are two major ways this can be done. One is the zigzag method, that is, the signal is uplinked from broadcaster B1 on the Earth to satellite S1 and is transmitted downlinked to a receiver B2 on the Earth, thousands of kilometers away from B1. B2 then uplinks to another satellite S2, which downlinks to a receiver B3, etc. This sequence of uplinks and downlinks looks like a zigzag line around the surface of the Earth, hence several satellites are needed to accomplish this task. The other major way is to uplink only once and have the signal retransmitted, cross-linked, between stationary orbit satellites. Each satellite downlinks the signal it receives and also cross-links it to the next stationary orbit satellite. The distances between the satellites are very large, thousands of kilometers, so the signals cross-linked from one satellite to the next need to be strong. As the technology improves, it will become increasingly possible to receive signals on your wristwatch receiver from stationary orbit satellites above your position on the Earth. Thousands of channels of television and radio and the internet will be receivable in this way. With billions of people wanting such a device, they could be manufactured very cheaply with massive economies of scale. They could also be made very small so that they could be smuggled easily into those dictatorial countries where such receivers would be banned. Hence, it will be possible for everyone to receive all the media of the whole planet and the internet as well. This technology will cause a revolution in people's educational levels, their attitudes and their aspirations. It will be a major factor in the global cultural homogenization process. Once the technology is fully possible, then the globers should start pushing for its use, for the launching of the satellites paid for by their governments, perhaps as aid. Poor people in third world countries can then be taught to read and write to improve their farming techniques, etc. It's fairly easy for dictatorial governments to control the internet because it's usually optical cable based. Cables are easily controllable because they are very local and locatable. The signals in these cables can be processed and censored. This is what the Chinese government is doing at the time of writing. The Chinese government does not want its population learning about the atrocities committed by its figurehead Mao Zedong, who it is estimated killed about 70 to 80 million people in his 30-year reign of terror. The CCP, Chinese Communist Party, does not want Chinese citizens joining together to form political groups that could overthrow it, so they censor the internet heavily. But how do you censor a signal coming from a stationary orbit satellite? The signal is spread out over 1 million square kilometers. The only way to stop undesired signals coming down is to shoot down the satellite itself. Since China is now a space power, it has the rocket technology to shoot satellites out of the sky. It has been experimenting with such techniques at the time of writing, despite strong protests from democratic governments. Ad-libbing, China did actually shoot down one of its own satellites, sending a message to the rest of the world. Don't use stationary orbit satellites to indoctrinate, from their point of view, the CCP's point of view, our Chinese citizens. Otherwise we'll shoot your satellite out of the sky. Back to the book. So probably what will happen is that China will not receive such signals because the owners of the satellites will be afraid of losing them. But smaller dictatorial countries which do not have the rocket technology or super laser technology to destroy satellites will see their citizens bombarded from the sky with subversive information that will educate their populations into modern democratic ways, leading in time to the creation of democracies in those countries. China will then become more and more the pariah nation, the odd man out, the only major country in the world that is not a democracy. But the economic growth of China is such that within about 10 to 15 years, I'm calculating, the major eastern cities of China will have standard of living comparable with modern Western countries. The educated middle classes in all their hundreds of millions in these cities will simply exercise their people power and either push the CCP to reform itself into a democratic pluralistic party or just push it aside. See Figure 1, Chapter 3. Sooner or later, China will go democratic, and when it does, the planet will be very different. Global cultural homogenization will have then taken a huge leap forward. As the remaining 1/3 of countries on the planet at the time of writing that are still not democratic become democratic, then that too will allow a much faster growth of global cultural homogenization. Satellite signals from the sky in their thousands from all over the planet will probably play a major role in the democratization of the remaining 70+ dictatorial governments still left on the planet. L. English, the global language. It should be obvious to anyone who is starting to think about the creation of a global state that it's essential that there should be a global language. Otherwise peoples with different languages cannot communicate. They are then locked into their mono-cages with only one culture's set of ideas and values that may differ from those of other cultures. Because of the language barrier, the citizens of these different cultures cannot swap ideas easily, so attitudes remain different, causing all kinds of misunderstandings and distrust. When another person cannot communicate with you, you are more likely to mistrust him than someone who can communicate with you fluently. With no communication, there's no emotional exchange, so it's virtually impossible to feel any human warmth with that person because he cannot express his feelings towards you. He can't express himself at all, nor can you to him. Hence the globalists need to foster the development of a world language as a vital stepping stone towards the creation of Globa, the world state. What can be done? It's arguable that a world language will emerge automatically, spontaneously, even if there are no political groups actively pushing for it. There are many social, economic, practical, technological, political reasons why English is becoming the world language. Let us start with a practical need for a world language, which is probably the strongest driving force towards its creation. With the growth of the world economy, thanks largely to the jumbo jets, the internet and cheap international phone calls, business people started travelling across national boundaries in large numbers. To be able to conduct business, the ability to communicate fairly easily is essential. Of course, one can always use interpreters, but that's not as good as both parties in a business deal being able to relate with each other emotionally in the same language. It's easier to clinch a business contract if the other guy likes you than if he feels you are an incomprehensible alien. So, world-travelling business people tend to get fairly fluent in English so that they can do business. When university graduates join international firms, a prerequisite is often that they speak good English. There are many factors pushing towards the creation of English as the world language. For example, global tourism. When the tourists meet the locals, often they will converse in broken English because it is the only language that the two have in common. I've seen Greek and Danish tourists communicating in English with each other for this reason. International scientific conferences are held almost exclusively now in English. Any hopeful PhD student who wants to write scientific papers and attend such conferences needs to improve his/her English. English is now the world's most spoken and studied second language. There are more students or second language speakers of English in India and China than there are Americans. International airline pilots talk to their airline traffic controllers in English, so pilots have to know English well. Young people want to learn English so that they can understand the lyrics in pop songs. Pop bands write their songs in English because they know that by doing so their market will be a lot bigger than singing in their own local language. Many international organizations conduct their discussions in English. Computers are programmed in English all over the world because most of the computer languages were conceived by Americans. All these phenomena and more are pushing the world into speaking English as the world language, and it will only happen once, I argue. It will not happen a second time. It is really only a historical accident that it is English, actually American, that has become the world language, because for the past half century, as the world has globalized, it happened to be the US that was the dominant culture. Once one world language has been more or less agreed upon by the world's citizens, there will not be another one. It takes a huge amount of time and effort to really master a language, with its thousands of words and an even greater number of stock phrases and idioms. In many respects, learning a language is tantamount to learning the culture that speaks it, and this can take years. The world will simply not bother to learn a second world language. Once the snowball effect has run to completion in making a particular language the world language, people will stick with it because they already know it and it does the job. They can use it to communicate with the planet. This only one world language is similar to the so-called QWERTY effect. That's QWERTY, the QWERTY effect. The letters QWERTY are found at the top left row of keys on a standard Roman alphabet keyboard. Once people start typing a lot, they usually learn to touch type. That is, they move their 10 fingers so that a given letter key is always hit by the same one finger. With practice, typing becomes unconscious and fast. An unconscious mechanical memory of which letter key is hit with which finger is established. E.g., the letter E is always hit with the left middle finger. Now imagine someone who has mastered this keyboard having to type on a different keyboard. This happened to me when I started living in French-speaking culture in Brussels. The French have an AZERTY, A-Z-E-R-T-Y keyboard. When I first confronted with a French keyboard, my frustration was audible. Shit! It really was annoying. So a lot of people talk about the QWERTY effect now to mean anything that takes a lot of effort to learn, that does the job, that is really annoying to have to relearn, hence one sticks with the original. Learning English as the world language will be a QWERTY effect type of phenomenon. Now, assume in a few decades English is unquestionably the world language. What effects will this have? There will be many consequences. The main effect will be that the world's media can be written and spoken in the world language, and billions of people will be able to understand it. The more media that is in English, the greater will be the number of people who choose to learn English until a condition of saturation is reached. Billions of people will use English to consult the internet. They will have access to infinite knowledge, but they will need to know English to use it. There will be automatic translation programs, but getting a machine to translate well at human level will require human-level artificial intelligence, and I doubt very much we will have that within 50 years. Artificial intelligence